Hello, welcome to this introductory video. We are going to start off this course by looking at an example of Easter Island and how it relates to environmental science. Specifically, we are going to be learning a lesson in sustainability and what happened to Easter Island. We also want to make sure that people who are taking this can figure out the process that we'll use a couple times of you guys watching a video online, followed by a quiz. And this is a shorter version of what some of the follow-up videos will be. But we want to make sure that this process works. We will be learning some important things in this video as they relate to environmental science, and this word sustainability, you will see it come up pretty often. We're going to define it and also see how it relates to human population. First of all, just so you know about Easter Island, you may have heard of it. It's a pretty small island. It's about 62 square miles. It is, that compares to Old Bridge is about 2/3 the size of this island. So this is about 50% bigger than the entire town of Old Bridge, and it's way out there. It is known. A lot of people know that it's part of the nation of Chile, but this was not an island that was settled by South Americans. It was settled by Polynesian people, and these are the people of, say, the Hawaiian Islands and South Pacific Islands, and they arrived by boat. They are well known to be very good at getting around on their catamarans. They followed the progress of Polynesian people going from island to island, separated by thousands and thousands of miles. They even know that ancient Polynesian people rode as far as South America, and this was long before these places were found by Europeans. So this is the lesson so far is that Easter Island is a very small island and it's very remote. It was named by the first European to have documented landing there in 1722. A Dutch explorer arrived there and found it on the day of Easter, so he named it Easter Island. By the time the Europeans arrived there, the things were not looking too good for the people of Easter Island, and unfortunately, as often happens after the Europeans arrived, they made things far worse, and we're not going to really worry too much about that. But the point to that is just that whatever written records, there were very few, and also any kind of legend that was passed down. The people who lived on Easter Island were nearly decimated and nearly went extinct by the actions of Europeans. So we don't really have too many records as far as what was passed down from generation to generation. If you've ever heard of Easter Island, it's probably for these statues that are very iconic. These are called the moai, these statues. There's nearly 900 of them found on Easter Island, typically along the coastline. I go back and show you these dots on the map here. These represent the location of these statues, and you can see that they're pretty much all located along the coast because that's where the people lived. They built them near their villages. These statues are just enormous. Some of them are over 200 tons, and they were moved, some of them as far as 6 miles from where the quarry was, where they got the giant stones from to carve these things out of. When even the first Europeans got there, they realized how could they move these enormous statues so far, because the island has no trees. There is, they assume that a giant stone like that, you would take logs and roll them along, and just that's something that's been known, ancient people moving enormous rocks like that. But this island is completely devoid of trees when the first Europeans got there. Plus, there was no vines to use as ropes to aid in moving these things along. When the Europeans got there, the people were not looking too good, and there was a lot of hunger, and these were not a prosperous people by the time the Europeans arrived there. And the thing is, these statues were not built by people who were hungry. These were built by a prosperous community, and one that definitely did not resemble what the Europeans discovered when they got there. So what happened to Easter Island? This is on the on the left, this is not a picture of Easter Island right here. This is, excuse me, this is not a map of Easter Island. This is, you know, what we would expect Easter Island to look like based on its climate, based on the location of it, the ocean currents, and what other islands in a similar situation would look like. Very lush, completely covered by plants and trees, an abundance of palm trees. This is an actual photograph of what Easter Island looks like today. It resembles more of a desert. The only vegetation there are some grasses and things like that. There's no trees, barely any shrubbery higher than, say, your waist. So we're going to try to figure out what happened there. So first of all, we have to define a couple words as that all refer to resource. So you may be most familiar with this term of a renewable resource, and this is something that into our vocabulary is used a lot. But I want to make sure you don't confuse a perpetual resource with what we call a renewable one. A renewable one is one that gets consumed but can be replenished in a short period of time. Typically, trees are. That was not the case in Easter Island because they used them too quickly. The people that lived on Easter Island used them so quick that they could not be renewed in the time frame of a human life. So they were potentially renewable, but the trees in our environment, we do use them with a little more management so that they are a renewable resource, but it can be overused, and this is unsustainable. A lot of the things that we think of as a renewable resource are actually perpetual. Solar energy and wind, these are resources that can be used pretty much without limitation. That as much solar energy as we use today will not affect the amount of solar energy available to us tomorrow or the next day. So those are actually perpetual resources. The last term here is a non-renewable, and these are not replenished really ever, but the definition is not within a human time frame through natural processes. Minerals, oil is really not a renewable resource at all. We're not producing any more crude oil on our planet. Not that we do it. Nature is what created crude oil and coal and things like that, and those are non-renewable. So back to our discussion of Easter Island. How do scientists know what Easter Island looked like and that it was once lush, more than just inferring that from where its location, what its climate is? And there are a couple of freshwater lakes on the island, and they're able to take cores from the bottom of the lake sediment. This is actually a pretty common method used by scientists when they want to learn about how things used to be in a certain ecosystem. And when they take the sediment from the bottom of this lake, they find pollen. They look at it with a microscope. They can use carbon dating to see how old that pollen is. And what they find is that there were more than 20 plant species that are not present on Easter Island anymore, including trees, palm trees, vines, flowers, etc. And they do know that this would resemble some of the modern islands and the tropical forests that appear on them. Further, there were cave drawings found on Easter Island from early people, and in these cave drawings, they drew pictures of trees. And studies have shown that somewhere several centuries ago, the trees and other plants pretty much disappeared completely. So, original resources on Easter Island, there was an abundance of these primary producers, meaning plants, not just trees, but edible plants and things like that. And these were renewable resources at the disposal of humans. Timber to build structures and shelter out of, vines to make rope out of. They would burn trees, and that would be a fuel source for them. They would make clothes from the fibers. These giant statues they made, they were able to use the logs to roll them up to 6 miles away from the quarries. And very importantly, they were able to make boats that would be used for fishing. We pointed out that the Polynesians were very good at using boats, but if you don't have trees, you cannot make a boat. And it made it very hard for them to go fishing. The only fishing they could do would be from the shoreline. Um, so to look further about what went wrong on Easter Island is the deforestation. So they had a lush forest, but it went away completely because of what was an unsustainable use of renewable resources. And this disrupted the food web. It caused other animal species, I mean, other than humans, to disappear completely, and a loss of this, what we call biodiversity, which is how many different species of life is present, and not just the plant species that directly went away, but some of the loss of bird and other animal species to disappear completely. So the unfortunately, what also arrived with the first Polynesian people were rats. These boat trips, the next closest island to Easter Island is over 1,000 miles away, and they estimate that a boat trip could take up to 20 days. So they were not arriving on little canoes and rafts. These would have been larger boats capable of holding enough food to carry the men that rowed these boats for a month or more. So these were pretty large boats. And rats back in the day, when they were settled, they were just a fact of life that people were just used to carrying rats around with them, and they arrived on the very first boats that came to the island. And the rats did very well there because they had no natural predators present. So once the rats arrived, besides the humans cutting down the trees and using them quicker than they could be replenished, the seeds that came from these trees were consumed by rats, and there is fossil evidence that they find the shell casings with gnaw marks on them that are consistent with rats breaking these shells open and eating the seeds. And unfortunately, the whatever chance there was of regrowing trees there went away with the consumption of their seeds by rats. So for the most part, trees went extinct on this island. Another introduction of another word that we will use is this carrying capacity. So carrying capacity is really the ability of an ecosystem or environment to carry a population of a species, not just humans, but whatever we're looking at. And by the year 1500, oh, the birds that were so plentiful on the island when humans got there were gone. As soon as the trees and plant life got decimated, there was no reason for birds to stick around. So they either flew off to other inhabited places or just died off themselves. Human food sources did start to disappear. Of course, they could eat the rats that were so abundant, but the mutualistic relationships, it took a very important part out of the food chain, and this led to the disappearance of animals and the abundant plant life that was there. But the capacity to carry humans was exceeded. And look at this graph. This shows at least a theoretical carrying capacity, meaning how much, how well can that environment or ecosystem carry a population. In this case, we're talking about humans. So human consumption, as the population increased, you get this part called an overshoot. And when when the capacity of the environment to carry and produce for the consumption of a population is overshot, that's when really bad things start to happen. And also very important is that you realize that as the population increases, the carrying capacity does not stay constant and it will start to decrease. As humans overconsume, they diminish the ability of these trees to replenish in time. So now you have not just a population that exceeded the original carrying capacity, but the misery will be further increased as the capacity of an ecosystem to provide has been lowered. So the potentially renewable resources became non-renewable, and this caused a double whammy, is that as you start to remove plants from an ecosystem, the plant's roots kept the soil intact. The Easter Island is a volcanic island, which means that the terrain is very hilly. It's basically mountains that come out of the surface of the sea. They rise from the sea floor, but they're very sloped, and the hills are more susceptible to erosion. And as they reduce the vegetation, there's no roots to hold the topsoil in place, so you get major erosion. And once you take the topsoil is really something part of the course we'll look at later on. But the topsoil is maybe the top few feet, and that's where all the nutrients are. As the topsoil gets washed away, what you're left with is the nutrient poor soil, the subsoil that's underneath that. And even if you were to plant seeds there, they can't grow due to the lack of nutrients. So these people, they did practice agricultural farming methods, but crop yields were decreased dramatically because the soil quality was diminished. Human population was affected. It was, and there's a lot of debate over this, but it is estimated that as many as 15,000 people lived in this island that was 62 square miles. But it was a limited number of resources, and the population at some point exceeded. This type of graph, what you see here, where it shows you the carrying capacity, we looked at a similar graph a little bit earlier, and you have the population growth being represented here. Thomas Malthus was, in the year 1798, released his theory about this. And this type of graph is called a Malthusian population graph. And this part of the graph is referred to as a Malthusian catastrophe, when the population exceeds the carrying capacity, and then you see the population will start to drop off. This graph does not even consider the fact that the carrying capacity is diminished as the population exceeds the carrying capacity. But the mathematics of this, what Thomas Malthus said, is that population growth is exponential. So this part of the graph, it has a very rapidly increasing line here, and mathematically that's done by the calculations are done using exponential growth, and population growth is known to be exponential. And if there's nothing limiting population growth, this would continue on to infinity. And what Thomas Malthus pointed out is that you cannot have a population go on to infinity, not even close. You will get to a point where the carrying capacity limits it, and once you get that overshot where the population exceeds the carrying capacity, then there will be a natural corrective factor that brings the population down. And if you happen to be an unfortunate part of the population in this part of the graph right here, you're not going to be a happy camper. You're going to be the corrective factors are things like starvation or lack of water or other resources. So it's not a good thing to be a part of the population in this part of the graph. Food production can only grow via arithmetic. It cannot grow exponentially, meaning the ability of an ecosystem, even humans, to produce more food. That does not grow exponentially. You can increase it, but it's usually just by addition, not exponentially. So if we look at a graph of Easter Island's population history, there's a lot of debate. Some people think that the first humans probably didn't even get to Easter Island until the year 1000 AD. So there is some debate about it, but the general shape of this curve is showing that you had this Malthusian kind of shape to it, an exponential growth, and there was a certain point where you get to the overshot here, which is assumed to be somewhere around this part of the graph where the capacity of that environment to hold humans was exceeded. And there are estimates anywhere up to 20,000, but at least 10,000 people lived there, maybe closer to 15. And the decrease in population did occur before the first Europeans arrived, that the population was already decreased. And whatever the maximum population was, 10,000, 15,000, when the first Europeans arrived there in 1722, the population was around 2,000. So that's a pretty small fraction of what there was at the peak. but you see, this really is the population drop after that was due to the influence of Europeans on it. And the population was, unfortunately, through the diseases that Europeans brought, some slavery. They took large part of the surviving population away, and the population did decrease to just over 100 people at one point. The population now has rebounded, but all the people that live on that island that are natives descended from just a small population of 111 people at one point. So anyway, we look at this and how can we relate this microcosm, what happened here, how can we relate this to the entire Earth? So isn't the entire Earth just a closed system too, just like Easter Island was? And we want to be able to relate what happened there to maybe what's in store for humans on our planet. So really, sustainability, the definition is just to be sustainable, you want to use less than what the Earth can provide. And the Earth is capable of replenishing certain things that we use, and sustainability just means using no more than what the Earth can produce. So sustainability is the capacity to endure, to have a population that can really continue to survive indefinitely based on not using more than what Earth can provide for us. And for us, the potential for long-term maintenance of Earth's resources, and meaning sustainability will not happen accidentally. It's going to have to be managed by humans. And back to Easter Island, they really just used more than they could sustain themselves. So they overconsumed. So what about Earth's carrying capacity? Here's the world population growth. We're right around here right now. So you can see over time, it looks like the population growth was small for the last couple hundred years, and then maybe around 1950 it started to really take off. What this graph shows you in the orange on the bottom is the industrialized regions. That's a nice way of saying rich people on the planet, rich nations, whereas the yellow is the poor nations. And the population growth, for the richer nations, there is an increase in population, but the poor nations, right now, that's the by far the majority of growth of human population is in poor nations, and it's assumed to be based on current estimates that's where the vast majority of population growth will occur, is in the poor nations of our country. So population growth again is exponential. We can't continue forever like this. This cannot keep going up towards infinity. And the population is relatively stable only in the rich nations where people are capable of providing for themselves. However, we can't just blame the environmental problems that are already present and more to come on the poor nations, because people that live in rich nations, each person per person, we're talking about per person, richer nations consume more, a lot more than people that live in the poor nations. So there's this term of ecological footprint, meaning how much does a person actually take from the earth. And affluence, meaning people who are rich. Being rich increases your demand. You're able to consume more than a poor person. And a disturbing fact here is that if every person on the whole planet consumed the amount of resources that an average person in the United States does, we would need 4.5 planet Earths just to provide for the people who lived here. So the poor nations are continuing on their path towards overpopulation, but the rich nations are continuing on their path of overconsumption. Here is a graph that is showing that not just Americans, but this is the whole globe, that we are in the portion of this graph of overshoot, meaning that the biocapacity is Earth's carrying capacity. And there's a little bit of debate, but some people say in the 70s, maybe into the early 1980s, that the population of Earth started to consume more than what the planet Earth was capable of providing. Not a very long time ago, it's before you were born, but not before I was born, that the overshoot actually started to occur. But what's disturbing is that look how much it's increased. By the time you get to, and this isn't even up to date here, this is only a little bit past the year 2005, we're now overshooting by 50% of what Earth can provide. So if just now, at today's rate, it would take 1.5 Earths to continuously provide what we're consuming now, and there's no reason to believe that we will not slow down in our consumption. So why do we feel like we don't have the things that we need? You go to a grocery store and the shelves are packed with enough food to sell to everybody. We don't feel this overshoot yet. Who is the overshoot going to affect first, though? It's not the people that live in rich nations. Certainly not, because we can afford the food. If there's a finite amount of food, it's going to go to the wealthy people, those who can afford it. It's definitely the poor that's going to be feeling the effect of this overshoot first. So, is this our future? We have overpopulation. That's already the case. We are using renewable resources faster than they can be replenished, so they're not truly renewable. The depletion of non-renewable resources, not just oil, but minerals and things like that, cannot be replenished at all. So we're using them and they're not coming back. Potentially renewable resources, we're consuming renewable resources faster than they can be replenished. Poverty, the majority of the population of the planet Earth already lives in poverty, so that's no reason to believe that's going away. We have to really choose between greed or sustainability. And technology. Technology has helped in certain parts. It's increased how much food we can get per acre of land in agriculture, but also technology have made cars cheaper, so more people can afford to drive cars. That's going to just increase the rate of consumption. So what's the end line here? There's going to be starvation, violence. Wars tend to break out. Back to Easter Island, when Europeans got there, all of those Moai statues were toppled over because of a civil war that occurred in the past. The only fortunate thing there is with no trees, they couldn't really build very good weapons for their war. So you couldn't even make a bow and arrow because they didn't have the resources to make them. So the death from war didn't happen there, but it has happened elsewhere, and there are parts of this planet already where people are fighting over resources such as fresh water and food. And disease will start to increase as populations get more densely populated, especially in poor nations. So, sustainable solutions for the future. We aren't there yet. We are not presently living in a sustainable society. And being sustainable, to point it out, this is bad for the economy. Economy is best when we consume more, but it's bad for the environment. So, for the first time, we're talking about how economy relates to environment, and sometimes they're at odds with one another. What's good for the environment is not good for the economy, and vice versa. Sometimes they do both benefit, but oftentimes, if these things were good for the economy, we would be doing them already. And so we need to sustain not just humans, but also all life for the future. Not just we're not just talking about sustaining humans. We need to conserve certain resources for future generations, and we haven't done a good job of developing long-term solutions and getting our ecological systems fully functioning. Bottom line, we can't keep going and living like we are today without sustaining Earth's natural systems there. Population growth is probably the biggest environmental concern right now. And as the population of the planet increases, the amount of withdrawal of resources, obviously, that would increase also. Every day, the population of the planet grows by 200,000 people, and along with that, consumption increases. The high standard of living that we enjoy in the United States, that also goes with high resource consumption, and it increases the burden on the environment. And the increased affluence is not equal. The gap between rich and poor, that gap keeps increasing also. So, if everyone on the planet consumed like we consume in the rich nations, we'd already be done for. There's this concept of an ecological footprint, meaning how much land does it take to supply for a human on the planet. And this graph shows hectares, which is a metric unit of area. 1 hectare is about 2.5 acres in what we're more familiar with. And in the world average, it takes about 2.7 hectares per person on the planet to supply what people are consuming. So 2.7 is the average, and guess who's number one on this graph? It's the US of A. We're number one here. We consume far more than any other the people in any other country per person. So it takes about 8 of these hectares to provide for a citizen, a person living in the United States. Canada's not too far behind, but you can see there's a huge difference here. A poor nation such as Mozambique in Africa, that the average person needs less than 1 hectare. China and India are the two most populous nations. China, 2.2 hectare, but that's times over 1 billion people. India is far less, and we see maybe for the first time that the type of culture can impact it. India, a lot of Indians don't eat meat, and meat consumption is going to make your footprint a lot larger because of the amount of land that it takes to raise animals. So some of the increased population and consumption, so increased population being an issue in poor nations, consumption in the rich nations, this will increase erosion from agriculture. And the more you grow, the more erosion occurs. But this term deforestation, that's where you turn forest into farmland. That's not such a good thing. Turning forest into farm really cuts down on things like biodiversity. You're replacing all of the species that can live in a forest with one. If you're growing corn, for example, you're chopping down trees and vegetation, displacing all the animals that live there, and replacing it with one species, corn. Pollution, toxic substances is going to increase. Mineral extraction and mining will increase as the population increases. Depletion of fresh water, that's a problem in a lot of the world. Even in the United States, we don't see it on the East Coast too much, but out west, they have people that really they cannot produce enough fresh water, that meaning the environment cannot produce it for the number of people out there. But we're a rich nation. We'll pay whatever it takes to get fresh water. We need it to live every day. So whatever the price, we can afford to pay it. Poor nations, not so much. Air and water pollution, global climate change, a whole issue on its own. And the earth is decreasing its biodiversity, the number of different species that are present. And so to finish up here, we're talking the idea of sustainable development. How can we continue to develop it in a way that's sustainable, not just taking what we need, but also preserving what they're going to need in the future. And there are 3 different parts to this. Of course, the environment needs to be sustainable. It has to be done in a way that's economical and viable. So we can afford to undergo sustainable development because we're a rich nation. Poor nations, they have economic problems. So even though we can afford to do it, we don't. And also there's social. If we need to change attitudes of people, maybe stop driving and using mass transit, eating less meat and more vegetables, and that will increase sustainability. And then we also have to consider with some of the poorer nations that we talked about, specifically China and India, their economies are improving. And if they start to increase their consumption rate, and there's over 2 billion people in just those 2 nations, that's going to make the overshoot even more dramatic. So that is it for our introductory lesson here. You are now ready to complete the online quiz. I wish you luck.